Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. A new round of talks aimed at resolving a trade war between the US and China is set to take place in London today. The outcome of these discussions could greatly impact global markets, which are currently unsettled by trade tensions, but also shed some light on geopolitical games of interest. In the meantime, China's decisions to expedite the approval of rare earth exports to European Union companies signifies an important shift. With Tomasz Włostowski, managing partner of EU Strategies, we'll delve in the perspective of a new economic chapter between China and its rivals. Good morning. Thank you for being with us here on TVP World. So let's start with a recent development. China has offered to accelerate rare earth export approvals to EU firms and so finalize its probe into EU brand imports by July 5th. So how significant is this gesture in a broader context of EU-China relations, in particular given last year's rising trade tensions?
Well, look, I think China is definitely sending a delicate signal that it has the power and the ability to accommodate European interests, as long as the European Union also recognizes and appreciates and deals carefully with Chinese interests in Europe. I think China's been very wise and patient in terms of building up its own, capabilities and power. I mean, let's remember, China is, a very old, thousands of years old culture and power. And, they have a certain way of thinking about strategy and about policy, and they plan very well in advance. It's funny, but one of the great strategists of war, Sun Tzu in Art of War, some of his main principles are that you need to plan well in advance, that wars are won before they start. And the Chinese have been very savvy and very smart in the way they plan their economy and the way they plan their dealings with the world. And if we look at exactly what China's been doing in the last couple of years, it's been signaling and picking a number of points where it can hit both American but as well as European interests. The rare earths development is a perfect one. It was, let's recall, it wasn't an action against the EU, it wasn't an action against the US, it was just a new export licensing system that China has developed that led to some bottlenecks and constraints in Chinese exports of rare earths to the world. But what did it actually accomplish? It showed both Europe and the US how powerful China can be if it wants to, because a minor bottleneck basically hit both the EU and the US very powerfully. We have a number of trade investigations in China on pork, on brandy, which is also, it just signals to the Europeans, look, if we really want to hurt you, we have the ways to do it, so please don't make us do that to you, basically.
That's understood. But at the same time, EU-China negotiations on Chinese-made electric vehicles have entered another phase, final phase, with discussions on minimum price commitments. Could this be seen as a breakthrough or merely a pause in what many fear is an inevitable trade confrontation?
Look, I think no. I've been telling all my clients that if they're really interested in observing EU-China relationship and wanting to predict where it's going to go, this point that you just raised is the single one most important indicator of where things are going. Let's remember, the Chinese were very unhappy with the EVs investigation. This was one of the first investigations that the Commission did out of its own initiative. This is a very important thing. Normally, these cases are started at the request of the industry. Here, it's the European Commission that self-initiated an investigation against Chinese EVs. So the Chinese perceive this as a direct attack by the European Commission on China. These duties, the countervailing duties, the investigation ended in December of last year with duties imposed. And the negotiations that you're referring to on the minimal import price is exactly the point where the European Commission can accommodate Chinese interests. And that's exactly why this is the development to watch. Because if the European Commission and the Chinese officials reach a deal on minimum price commitments, what basically this means is that there is a green light or rapprochement between the EU and China, because this is exactly where the Commission can give the Chinese exporters what they want, and this would be a signal from the Commission that we're open for business with China and we don't want an escalation. However, the longer these negotiations take, and they've been taking a long time already, the more difficult it is to reach a deal, and then the more adversarial the relationship becomes, and the Chinese can start pulling on all the levers that they've developed over time to pressure European interests.
The European Commission obviously has the power to negotiate with China, but how monolithical is European Union? China has also indicated willingness to strengthen rare earth export controls dialogue with relevant countries. So can you interpret this as a strategic pivot toward a more selective partnerships within the European Union, or a sign of pressure simply from global supply chain disruptions?
Well, exactly. I mean, as we've already discussed, the Chinese are very smart in how they do this. And the licensing system they've developed, of course, does not treat the European Union as a singular entity. And this, by the way, is the approach that a lot of foreign countries do. The United States also does not treat the EU as a singular sort of entity. So the fact that the Chinese are giving themselves the power to allow the exports to certain member states and not to the others, of course, it increases their leverage over the EU and over the EU member states. Answering your question directly, how united is Europe over China? Well, it's not. It's completely not united. There are different, I would say, interests that the Central European countries have and the Western ones. That's number one. Of course, for a lot of the Western European countries, China is predominantly perceived as a major export market for its goods. For our part of Europe, I think, number one, of course, it is a huge export market, but also it is a big potential investor and a source of, number one, investment, but also of know-how and technology. That's number two. And then there are other issues like the the Chinese-US relationship, which probably plays a bigger role in our part of Europe than, let's say, in Western Europe. And also the Chinese support for Russia, which of course is a big problem for countries like Poland and some of the other Central Europeans, but much lesser issue for some of the Western European ones. So yes, there is no sort of uniform approach to China in Europe, and that's why the Chinese will be very smart in how to pressure individual member states over this.
So do you think it's a leverage on the part of European Union, or rather a burden in these relations?
Well, in a way, I think it makes the European position more difficult. And let's just go back to the trade investigation that you brought up. Normally in trade investigations, the Commission has the ultimate power to propose and to enter into deals, and the European Commission is the one that investigates trade disputes. However, at some point, the member states have to agree. And that's where how each member state approaches the topic is extremely important. And this will be very important going forward on a number of other trade investigations and in general in approving the direction of the EU-Chinese relationship. So the Chinese are very smart in signaling to different member states that they have the leverage. Let's remember the brandy investigation that the Chinese are conducting. Well, that's hitting, of course, the countries that produce brandy in Europe. And, not all of them do. Only certain ones. So that's a leverage point. The same thing with pork, for example. There's another investigation on pork exports. Again, only some countries export pork. So that gives the Chinese the power to affect how different member states react to the Chinese pressure and to the Chinese investigations. And those member states then pressure the Commission not to affect their own interests. And I think we've seen that, for example, with Spain, which is a big pork exporter, and it's been taking a much accommodating approach towards China.
So you've mentioned that before, but meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump is sending top-level officials to London for rare direct talks with Chinese counterparts. What's your take on the timing of these meetings, especially considering Donald Trump's repeated framing of China as the U.S. top geopolitical threat?
Well, look, I think, Donald Trump has encountered, I think, the enemy that he doesn't really have a good sort of approach to defeat. Because, as we've already discussed, the Chinese are very sort of savvy and methodological in how they approach the relationship with the world. They've been planning predominantly over the last few decades how to build up their own power. And therefore, short-term events, for example, like Donald Trump and the tariffs and the EU disputes with the EU, they don't really divert the Chinese from their own policies in terms of developing their own industries. If we see how the US-China trade sort of dispute developed, China was the one country that really did not seek to deflate or de-escalate the dispute. They've just retaliated with very high tariffs on their own. And if we look at what was the result, well, the result was that Donald Trump basically backtracked and removed most of it, not all of them, of course, but removed a lot of his tariffs. So if you look at how different countries approached the United States tariffs and what they received, China received the best results with the strongest approach possible. They retaliated and Donald Trump backtracked. So I think Donald Trump realizes he cannot really directly take on China. And I expect the negotiations to, maybe not immediately, but to result in a détente and de-escalation at some point or another. Also because within the United States, I think that's clear, the markets just do not have an appetite for a major trade confrontation with anyone. And I think Donald Trump has also realized that there's only so far he can take his trade wars, because then the stock market, the bond market, and the financial markets start reacting.
Tomasz Włostowski, thank you so much for sharing your insights here on TVP World with us. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And stay tuned to TVP World for more commentaries and continuous news.